Tim Keller, one of the greatest pastors of our time, who unfortunately just recently passed away, visited Columbia University and got hit with a really tough question about God from a former lifelong Christian. I think he responds beautifully, so we're going to check out how he responds, and then I'm going to give my thoughts on the back end. Let's get into it.
I went through 8 years of Catholic school, Sisters of Charity, and I got professional religious education throughout all those 8 years.
Wow.
Then I had 4 years of Jesuit prep school, and at the end of 12 years of religious education, I was an atheist. And then I came to Columbia. The sticking point in all that regarding religion for me was the Holocaust. I looked at that and I said, how is it possible that 6 million people could be exterminated in the course of a war that took 80 million lives, and there could be a God?
Good question.
How do you answer that question?
There's, I'm going to push back and ask you, there sounds like there's two motives behind the question. Maybe they're both true for you. They're both very important questions. One is how could European civilization, which is based on Christianity for 1,000 years, produce something like that? Or was it much more general, and that is, how in the world could God allow that kind of evil and suffering?
That's the question I want.
The second one.
Yeah, the second one. Much more interesting.
Well, the first one is a terrible question too. I mean, it's a terrible question to answer for a Christian minister. But as a pastor, I have to say that the Holocaust is awful, and yet as a pastor for the last 35 years, I've been sitting in rooms with people, as a pastor, with parents whose little, 2-year-old get run over by a car. I mean, it doesn't seem like a Holocaust, but it's the same kind of misery, the same question. Right. Why in the world would God allow evil and suffering? So I've been through it and through it and through it and through it. The right response to anyone who's actually in the middle of suffering is silence and love and speaking when spoken to. Answers I've given to people over the years when they've asked me. The one is, I actually don't believe it makes it any easier to handle or face suffering by disbelieving in God. And I actually do Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. He says, how do you know that a human deed is unjust, or a law? But he's talking about law, but how do you know a human law or deed is unjust? Only if there's a higher law that says it's unjust. Otherwise, what you've got out there is the strong eat the weak. That's how you and I got here. If there's no God, you and I came here through stronger organisms eating the weak organism, natural selection. That's what life's about. True. That's utterly natural. Now, deep in our hearts, we feel, no, that's not right. But, the question is why? Now, what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying is, we believe that strong eating the weak is unjust and wrong because there's a higher law. If there was no higher law, he says, how do you even really justify your outrage? And
yet the strong eat the weak every single day.
Yes.
So why doesn't God intervene and say, you know what? You can't kill all those people. Stop it.
Well, I said there were two responses. The first response only is that it doesn't make it any easier. I mean, it really doesn't, because now, on what basis am I morally outraged? If strong eating the weak is natural, so what? So they did it. Stronger nations eat weaker nations, stronger individuals. So what's the big deal? What's the problem? I mean, that's fair. I mean, that's not a complete answer, but it's fair to say, yeah, now as an atheist, now how am I dealing with evil and suffering? Now I really have only a visceral reaction to it. I don't even have a real cogent warrant for saying this is absolutely got to stop, other than I don't like it. But the second is, now you were raised, you went to Catholic school. The Christian view of God is very different than the other views of God, because the Christian view of God is that God came into this world and suffered. Now, I have a cat, and my wife and I love our cat, and we actually saw it once. We broke its leg by accident, but we fixed it for only $1,000, which we never in a million years would have thought we would ever do for a cat. But
well, you broke it, so.
We broke the cat.
you're kind of morally obligated.
And
in my
it
book.
suffered. It suffered. However, I think it's fair to say, because it doesn't have the same kind of self-consciousness, I would say that a human being suffering is probably at least sort of some kind of higher order. You're more aware of things. There's more agony than a. If God really came to earth in Jesus Christ, and the suffering he went through on the cross voluntarily would have been far beyond my suffering. Now, what does that do? It does not. Even after you believe that God would have come down and become vulnerable to suffering and death, that does not yet give us an answer to the question of what the reason is that God allows evil and suffering. But it does tell us what the reason isn't. It can't be that he doesn't love us, or he wouldn't have come down and gotten involved.
Yes.
It can't be that he doesn't care, or he wouldn't be involved. I don't know what the reason is he hasn't stopped it yet, but it can't be a lack of, it can't be a remoteness, it can't be indifference, or he wouldn't have come and gotten down involved. Now that assumes you believe the gospel. But if you believe the gospel, what it does is it keeps off the idea of indifference and says, I don't know why he hasn't stopped evil and suffering. But whatever the reason is, it can't just be indifference, hardness of heart, or lack of
Well,
love.
have you thought about it in terms of, the reason?
I mean, I actually tried to
Why didn't he come down and stop the Holocaust?
I don't know. But now,
Right.
at this point, you've got to ask yourself a question. If you can't think of a reason, does that mean there really can't be one? That's the Alvin Plantinga.
Right.
Have you heard the no-seums? Oh, this is good. You'll like this. Okay.
Lay it on me.
All right. Well, now, you're an academic, so you realize philosophers talk like this. Neither of us are really philosophers, but you do know how they talk.
I do indeed.
Okay. He says, if you look into a pup tent and I ask you, do you see any St. Bernards? And if you don't see any St. Bernards, you say, no, I don't see any St. Bernards, then we can safely conclude there probably are no St. Bernards in the tent, because if there were a St. Bernard in the tent, you'd probably see it. But he said, if you look into a pup tent and I say, do you see any no-see-ums? Now, no-see-ums, if you live near the Great Lakes, are little gnats that are so small they come through the screen and bite you anyway. And he says, so if you look into the pup tent and I say, do you see any no-see-ums? And you say, no, I don't see any see-ums. I don't see any no-see-ums. That doesn't mean that there aren't any no-see-ums in there, because if there were, you couldn't see them. And he says, now, when you say, because I can't think of any good reason why God would continue to allow evil and suffering to happen, therefore there can't be one, you're assuming that whatever reasons there would be more like St. Bernard's than no-see-ums. Well, why should it be? I mean, he says this is probably cold comfort. Without the gospel of Jesus Christ coming into the earth and coming alongside of us, it's cold comfort. But what he's saying is you can't assume that just because you can't think of a good reason why God hasn't stopped it yet, there can't be any. And then the gospel says, well, whatever that reason would be, it can't be a lack of love.
But if he is not willing, or it, or whatever, is not willing to come down and save innocent people, why should we worship him?
Well, I mean, that you're still...
what kind of a good God is that?
But you're still saying he can't be good because I can't think of any good reason why it would happen. And I'm still saying, why would you assume that? I mean, why would you assume that there can't be a good reason?
Because it's reasonable.
If they had just showed up at the door and he hadn't lost them in his mind, he would have just said, oh, hi. But because he had lost them, it was incredible. I wonder if there isn't some way in which, when we get it all back, it will be more wonderful for it having been lost. And I mean, it's a guess.
Even though Tim Keller just did a great job answering this young man's question, I think he still has this underlying thought and belief that God is not good. So real quick, we're going to challenge this belief by looking at some of God's promises to those who believe in him. He promises to take care of all of your physical needs. He will give you rest. He will give you direction. He will help you when you're hurting. He will give you peace, and he will save you from hell. And no amount of pain or suffering in this life on earth can even compare to the eternal measure of God's glory when we're in heaven as God's children with him. And let's not forget that the best person in all of history suffered the worst thing imaginable, which is when Jesus died on the cross for the penalty of the crimes that you and I have committed against the God of the universe. And I've been a Christian for 13 months, and God has always kept these promises to me. I mean, I've failed him many, many times, but he's always been faithful to me. And so I got to trust him there. And there's a whole book in the Bible about what to do with all this suffering and stuff. It's the book of Job. And in the book of Job, well, it's kind of complicated, but God allows the devil to get up in Job's business and just cause all of these horrible things to happen to him, like to kill off all of his kids and most of his servants and make him super sick and take away all of his cattle and just leave him in this terrible state. It's just some of the worst suffering imaginable. And you know what Job did by the end of it? Well, he said, you know, God, I don't know why you did this. You know, he's lamenting. He's in shambles. I mean, I can't even imagine what that would be like. Shoot. But he said, you know what, God? Like, I trust you. I trust you. And that's what we got to do. God is great and God is worthy of our worship. He promises to give us this everlasting life as long as we believe in him. So if you have doubts or you want to learn more about the evidence for God, I really recommend you check out the video on screen right about there. Have a great day. Bye-bye.